are so flippin' complex, right? Yeah. We have so many internal contradictions. So like, I think that it is also
possible
within one person to have these competing, contradictory beliefs and motivations.
Yes.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
Hi listeners, so you'll notice that I'm not with Ben this week, but that is because I have come to see and meet the incredible social innovators, changemakers, activists, academics, researchers, journalists, the list goes on here at the Skoll World Forum in Oxford. And as part of that, I am really excited to be sitting down with Pip Wheaton from Ashoka, who is doing all things planet and climate, because you do some really cool stuff around stuff that I love, which is around how do we talk about climate, how do we communicate, how do we make change and shift things, which is, something that Ben, my co-host, and I have been exploring on the podcast forever. So I want to ask you some questions about it. I know you've done some cool research here at Oxford as well that's just come out. But before we get started, please properly introduce yourself to our listeners.
So hi, I'm Pip Wheaton. I'm Australian, but I live in New Zealand.
That's like a whole other podcast.
Yeah, okay, great. And when I'm in New Zealand, I work for local government. So I work for Wellington City Council, and I do climate change stuff there with them. And the other hat that I wear, which is the hat that I'm wearing during this conversation, is that I work for Ashoka.
Awesome. So one of the things before when we were chatting about this is you talked about the idea of being stuck in some of our work on climate. Tell those of us who are not as immersed in climate where you might feel we're stuck and where change isn't maybe happening in the way that it needs to. I'm curious to understand where you imagine we are at this moment in time. So,
more than ever before, we know that the people care. We also have more solutions than we've ever had before. We've got heaps of solutions in the technology space. We know a bunch of the regulation solutions that need to happen. There's nature-based solutions. The list could go on. And we have a better understanding of the science that we've ever had before. So we know what the stakes are. And yet, even with those leaps of not only understanding, but also of public understanding, we're still not seeing change happen fast enough. And right. The way that we've been looking at this is the really human part of it. So when we talk about those technological solutions, who is it that's going to be taking those new technologies and implementing them, or changing the tech that they use at the moment for these new solutions that are climate positive? When we talk about regulations, who are the public officials that are going to be moving those new regulations through the institutions that they work in and so forth? And I think we talk a lot about individual behaviour change, and that's really good, that's really important. But when we're talking about these big systemic changes, we quite often remove the individual nature of the fact that people need to do these changes.
So there's a really interesting relationship here, something that we talk about here on the podcast, something that I personally kind of have been evolving my understanding around, which is the interaction of the relationship, or the responsibility between the individual and the system. And I feel like there's this, especially when, you're climate curious, you're starting to hear about this stuff, there's this onus given to the individual. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to stop this, you have to change this, you have to not eat meat, whatever it might be. And then that doesn't resonate so much. And then you look at systems change and moving these big systems where the individual maybe can't make those changes on their own, but then you realize actually there's agency. So anyway, this very convoluted question is to ask, what is this relationship? It feels difficult to know how much agency and responsibility lies in each place.
So there's a really interesting piece of research that looks at the different roles that people play or the way, like the roles through which they can have impact on emissions, basically, or impact on climate change. And they identified 5. And some of them we talk about quite a lot, and others we talk about far less. So the 5 are consumers, and I think that's where a lot of the individual behaviour change focuses. The second is citizens, so how we vote and how we engage our political representatives. The third one is in our relationships, so that's like both like interpersonal, in-person relationships, but also like how we show up on social media and stuff. The fourth one is investment, so like which bank do you use? It doesn't have to be like big investment, but even like where you put your money. And then the fifth one, and this is one that I think is probably what I find personally most interesting, is as organisational contributors. So whether that's as a volunteer or a board member or an employee or a business owner, like what's your influence in the organisations that you are part of? And like all of these have potential for contributing to systemic change, or like, when they're in aggregate, when they're all added up, they can contribute to systems change. But I think particularly in our organisational roles, there's a really interesting opportunity to make action be bigger than just a single individual.
Right, so this is really interesting, because what it's doing is it's looking at all the multiple identities that we have as a person, and not just assuming that we have one, and so therefore only one sphere of influence. So that's fascinating and a really different way to look at it. I think also this idea of where do you have power, right? How do you see that being used effectively, like in the research you've done?
So in the research, we looked at such a diversity of different approaches. So it was everything from working with fishing communities, like subsistence fishing communities, or and helping them like become stewards of the ecosystem, smallholder farmers, neighbourhoods in Birmingham in the UK, and big corporates, like sustainability managers, or even just like normal employees in big corporates. And I think that like it's interesting because like obviously each of those has different access to different types of powers and different levers and different influence. But at the end of the day, we have a tendency to underestimate the amount of power we have, or we really only think of it in like quite siloed ways. Because like part of the, and just to get a little bit philosophical for a second, like part of the problem that sits underneath climate change is that we have become so individualized. This isn't a new idea, but like, that we are disconnected from nature, we are disconnected from each other, we are disconnected from ourselves. Like, when we think of ourselves as individuals, then of course we don't see the full extent of our power.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the social entrepreneurs that we looked at, that we spoke to, there was a really big part of their approaches that was about helping people really engage in a deeply personal way with the topic of climate change, but also imagining new possibilities. If you can't imagine a future, how can you create it? And also seeing another one of the tactics that sort of sat with that was like making progress visible. So helping them see how their contribution was not actually just a single individual action, but how it actually fitted into a bigger whole.
So staying on that philosophical point for a second, I think this is really interesting in how we imagine the individual, because I asked you this question of individual versus systemic, right? Because I didn't even think about that there could be a third option, which is like group or community, or and that actually just shows how even in the way that we look at this, we have almost forgotten the communal aspect and how that's related to power.
Well, I mean, so when I said the individual collector, like, he was the first person I ever heard say that, right? And I was just like, oh, that makes so much sense. And like, it's not his idea, but he just like
articulates it
so beautifully.
Yeah, there's definitely something here around. But isn't this the truth though, that the part of me that sees oppression and injustice as a deliberate choice rather than an accidental outcome knows that those in power know that if they separate us and make us think that we're just one, that it keeps them in power longer.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it's a very deliberate tactic. It's like a very obvious thing, and we just forget it because we get lost in it.
It serves the vested interests and the status quo. I also think that I do think that there are people who are very definitely deliberately causing harm.
Right?
Absolutely. I also increasingly think that the majority of people who are complicit are not deliberately causing harm.
I agree. I think that it's not. I don't think people who wake up in the morning and go to work at Shell, I don't think anyone below, I don't even know what their hierarchy is, but below a certain level, wakes up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to go and put out a disinformation campaign and deny climate and hide the science and murder climate activists. I think they think, I'm going to work and I'm going to do this report and I'm going to answer these emails and then I'm going to go pick up my kid from school and what I'm going to make for dinner. And that's the insidious nature of the system we're in, is that those people actually don't, what are we supposed to do, just tell them not to work? They can't, they have to. So it's not even but then I think above a certain level, you're making an active choice. I think that there's above a certain level where you are making a decision because you could actually work somewhere else and you could do something else that would allow you to still have this quality of life that wasn't actually actively destroying the planet.
Well, no, I also think it is, humans are so flipping complex, right?
Yeah.
We have so many internal contradictions. So I think that it is also
possible
within one person to have these competing contradictory beliefs and motivations.
Yes.
If you fully own up to the true extent of your own influence and power, then you need to change everything. So it's actually a really scary thing to do. And so you're internally you create protection mechanisms.
I agree.
And so you don't own up to it, right? And so you convince yourself that actually I'm too small, it's too hard, it's too late. I'm not actually part of the problem. I'm just providing the services that people need. People want to drive their cars, and so you tell yourself all of these things. And I think there is a lot of cognitive dissonance.
That's it. And I think we really underestimate how powerful cognitive dissonance actually is in how it drives our behavior.
So when I think about this stuff, I quite often find it useful to pull up examples of people that I have worked with or have known and have engaged with them around climate change, because all of this is about making it personal, right?
Yes.
And so actually having ideas of specific individuals who have struggled or not made decisions or have made decisions in ways that are useful, I find really helpful to then try and go, okay, so what would they need?
Yeah.
And so this one person I'm thinking of in particular, they are in a position of huge influence. The really interesting thing for me when I was working with this person was to see how often we would get so close to doing something transformative, and then at the 11th hour they would get cold feet, and there would always be a really convenient reason why we couldn't do the really bold thing.
Wow.
And one of the things that it taught me, which I carry through into my work now, is that sometimes the work is to make courageous decisions not feel courageous. Actually to
interesting.
de-risk these things for the people who need to be doing things differently.
Before we continue, we wanted to tell you about the second best climate podcast. I'm joking. We wanted to tell you about a podcast that we absolutely love. Seriously, we love it. It's called Outrage and Optimism. It's a useful weekly guide for anybody wanting to make sense of the complexity of the climate conversation. So, whether you're suffering from climate grief or anxiety, guilty, or you are already fired up, full of hope and ready to take action, or even if you're like somewhere in between like most of us are, this podcast will help you navigate your feelings of outrage and of optimism and leave you feeling informed and inspired. It's hosted by one of our personal heroes, Christiana Figueres, and some other guys. No, I'm joking. And some pretty cool people, Tom Rivett-Carnac and Paul Dickinson. And the trio will be sharing their expertise, their insights, and their humour with the world's climate thought leaders. Search Outrage and Optimism wherever you get your podcasts. We would definitely, in fact, take this as our recommendation that you check it out. And remember, stay curious.
So I've heard this, where people talk about like the social cover that politicians need to be able to take the actions, or how, someone I worked with was talking about the letter that all those businesses wrote to President Biden when he came into office, saying it was like in the Wall Street Journal, right? And it was like all of these big American companies saying, take climate action. And it gave him the business cover to do it. So I totally understand that idea that sometimes even when people want to act, they need something that makes it not feel like they're being really, really brave.
And this was actually one of the tactics that we saw in the research.
Right. So tell me first, tell me a bit about the research. Like, what is it? What did you set out to look into?
Right. So we set out to look into. So if we take as the starting point that we need everyone, right? That we need as many people doing things differently as possible. So much so that it is actually everyone. We wanted to look at the approaches that social entrepreneurs were using to help people on that journey to proactively driving change, right? And I think there's a big difference between, and we saw in the research, there is a big difference between approaches that get people to do a thing, right, such that it is clearly delineated and if the social entrepreneur leaves, then they stop doing the thing, and getting people to proactively drive change themselves. And they're both needed because we need everything, but we were really interested in that second approach. And what we wanted to do was we were if we choose a diverse enough group of social entrepreneurs, both diverse in terms of geography, the types of change, the types of individuals that they were working with, if we could identify commonalities in the strategies and tactics that they used, then maybe those strategies and tactics might be useful in other contexts. And what we found was 3 different strategies, and each of them has different tactics that contribute to them. But the 3 strategies were making it personal, curating support, and realigning systems. So if we think about the letter that the businesses wrote to Biden, that would fall under the curating support strategy, and it was a tactic that we called helping them make the case. And we saw this in a lot of different ways, but a really good example of it we saw in the organisation Canopy.
Okay.
The Ashoka Fellow's name is Nicole Rycroft, and she's brilliant.
Can you give me an example of making it personal and then realigning systems as well?
One of the things about all of these strategies is that none of them on their own is enough.
Okay.
One organisation can choose to focus on one as long as the other things are happening within the context around them. Right. But the place that we saw them come together most powerfully was when the social entrepreneurs we were interviewing actually wove a number of different strategies together in ways that were suitable for the context. A brilliant example to bring this to life is a wonderful organisation called Civic Square in Birmingham. The Ashoka fellow who started it, her name is Imi Kerr. So Civic Square puts neighbourhoods at the forefront of their own climate transition. And one of the things that underpins that work is a deep belief that people can come up with solutions to even the knottiest of problems.
Right.
And something as complex and technical as climate change can often seem like really off-putting. So one of the things that they do is they have a layer of their work that they call the dream matter.
Oh, I love it.
And that's all about like giving people ways to engage with the complexity of climate change in ways that really deeply resonates. So they've done things like they've localized the donut economics framework for the neighborhood. They got people to make zines of the IPCC report. I mean, just brilliant. And all of these are ways that help people really build understanding. But another thing that they do in this part of the work is they bring people together to collectively imagine different possibilities of what the neighborhood could look like. And they do all sorts of other things in this space, but for me, that all translates to what we called in our research making it personal.
Okay.
Another part of what they do is looking at the sort of the rules and the codes that underpin the way that the world works, stuff that's like really often like invisible to us as we go about our daily lives. And they've had to, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get neighborhoods to come together and collectively take action.
Right.
They realized quite quickly that involved creating different contracts, creating different financing mechanisms. And if we take the language that we use in the research, that for us was about realigning systems.
Okay.
And then the third part of their work, which we sort of map onto the curating support piece, comes together in what they call the everyday matter. And that's really about how they turn up in the community day after day as like a consistent presence.
Right.
Like rain, hail, shine. Yeah. They are there, and if people just drop in for a cup of tea, that's fine. Yeah. If one person comes in a day, that's fine. But they are there reliably. And the thing that really struck me, was one of the surprises of the research, is the importance of injecting consistent, sustained energy into this really stuck system.
Right.
Because shifting inertia requires a huge amount of energy.
Right.
And that was one of the things that we saw the social entrepreneurs doing.
How fascinating. First of all, just such an incredible project. So those findings, I think, really are clear for me when I think about how organizations can, or communities can show up in this, and the things, the tools that they can use and the techniques they can use to bring about change, right? Because that's what that if I'm hearing right, that's what these three things do, right? Is they actually help us get unstuck. They move us faster in a more sustainable, equitable, and durable way. How do I, or if someone is listening, how do I do this? How do I implement this when I do feel like I'm this sole individual? What is, have there been, in the entrepreneurs with Ashoka that you've the social entrepreneurs at Ashoka that you've been researching, or just in general since you've come out with these findings, how has that manifested? How have you thought about that?
So the thing that I think is important here is that this is in relation, right? So the social entrepreneurs that we were studying, they were activating other people, right?
Right.
And so it was in relationship with others.
Right.
So the way that we've been thinking about these findings is that we want them to be useful to other people who are trying to shift people that they are in relationship with, whether it's in community, in businesses, in what.
When I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, I bet you there are people who really want to, because I think that I'm going to speak on behalf of my co-host here, but when Ben and I started on this journey together, I was a little bit further down the climate path than him, but not much. And so we've been on this 2.5 year journey together. And so now I think actually about in terms of in relation to the people in our lives, people do come and talk to us, or we do try actively go talk to people about climate. And so actually I think there will be people listening who are similarly starting to have that light bulb moment and starting to want to talk to people around them, and it can be tough if the people around you are whatever. And this feels like it gives people some real practical how information.
Yeah, and I think the core of it when you're thinking about the one-on-one relationship with people that you care about, that you're in like a sustained relationship with, I think it's about speaking to emotions.
Yep. That's mainly under making it personal, right?
Yeah, exactly. Climate change is such a technical topic, but when we talk about the technicalities, you trigger this frame of like, well, experts need to fix this.
Yes.
And I'm not an expert. And if you talk about it in terms of like the catastrophic impacts, if you don't then have a clear call to action, you can trigger this like doom and gloom, it's too big, it's too late frame. And so I think that if you can tap into the emotions, which, it's not to say that won't necessarily include some fear, but tap into the other emotions too, like care. Care is such a powerful one. What are the people and places and things that you care about?
Yeah.
And for me, I often think that climate action is a form of care.
That's so beautiful. Yeah. I think that will resonate with people too, because I think that care is so human, and it's something that I would say 98% of us probably do in our lives towards another person, even if it's, it doesn't have to be like a kid, maybe it's your parents, maybe it's your best friends, maybe it's like, there's so many relationships where care is there. How, especially given your role in local government with the other work you do, what's your either plan or hope around how this research might live in the world?
Right, so our hope is that we can, in the coming months, write it up into some sort of like really action-oriented, very practical, playbook, toolkit.
But something usable.
And so to do that, like we want to sort of make sure that there's really rich examples, and hopefully like some useful questions to help people, prompt them to think about the context that they're operating in, like really think, who are the individuals, what makes them tick, what do they care about, how can I make this really personal for them, and help them think through what might be needed.
I'm very excited for your toolkit because I feel like I will use it, and we will use it at TEDxLondon. I want to also understand something, because we actually, when we met here at the forum, we were talking to each other about the work we do around storytelling and narratives, and I'm curious to know how this research is going to tie into some of the work you're going to be doing around narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's like central to this research is like the concept of agency, how a person believes that they can impact the world. And our beliefs are shaped by so many different things. And as we dug into that more, we started to engage with the concept of narratives. And when we use the word narratives, like, because I think there's lots of different ways to interpret it, what we mean by that is like, what are the collective stories that we tell as a society that help us make sense of the world and therefore shape how we move through it?
Yes.
And to be clear, like, narratives are fluid, they ebb and flow. We can have like internally inconsistent narratives that we believe at any one time. Like, it's really fascinating. But one of the pieces of research that I came across showed that specifically for climate action, people's belief about whether or not change was possible was the biggest determinant of whether or not they acted. And so at the moment, we are in this point in time where the dominant narrative is around doom and gloom. And, it's really important that we've gotten to the place that people are starting to wake up and go, oh my goodness, climate change is real. It's not a future generation thing. It's happening now. It's happening in fires in Australia and California and Siberia. It's happening in flooding in New Zealand this year, when heat domes and changes to our rainfall patterns that are
clearly identifiable things.
Things that people go, oh, that thing, that's climate change. That's great. We needed that moment of awakening collectively. However, if we stay in that place of doom and gloom, we stay overwhelmed and we don't believe that change is possible. And if we don't believe that change is possible, that belief becomes self-fulfilling, basically. And so the thing that we're really curious about is like, if that's the narrative of doom and gloom and that's going to stop action, then what are the narratives of climate agency that help people realize their power?
Okay, this is very interesting. One of my favorite quotes actually is that you can't depress people into action, which I think is so accurate.
That's brilliant.
It's brilliant. And so much of the work I do, where I'm working with climate activists, scientists, etc., people who've been in this field for decades, the mind shift that they have to make from the work they've had to do tirelessly to convince people it's a problem to where they have to be now, which is to show people how we can solve this, is really difficult. And a lot of people are still stuck in the problem loop. Like, you just don't know how bad it is. You just don't know. Like, it's bad. And I find myself getting stuck in that loop sometimes.
Me too.
Because you're talking to someone who's like, you'd be like, you should be crying right now. Like, if you were not crying, I hate to get worse and worse. And you just feel like, do you understand the level of this? But what I am curious to know, and maybe, I don't know if you guys have thought about this or if it's part of this work, is, so there is that doom and gloom narrative that needs to change to this, like, agent, possible, these are the solutions, this is how we're going to do this, we can do this, we've done hard things in the past, etc. But there's this third one that's seeming to emerge, which is the deliberate use of misinformation by actors who are entrenched in the current system to make it seem confusing and difficult. And this is something that someone said to me recently, and I was like, yeah, that's like a classic playbook, isn't it? First you deny it, and then you make it say it's complicated. How does that play out into all of this?
There is the most brilliant academic article called The Discourses of Climate Delay.
Oh,
that has,
I like it already,
been turned into my favorite cartoon image that has, like, so they found 12 archetypes of the different arguments of delay, the discourses of delay, and a cartoonist turned each of those 12 into like a caricature person.
Incredible.
It's the most awesome image. And I also just love the, like, taking academic research and making it into like something like engaging and humorous and irreverent. And but the interesting thing is, like, when they were doing this research, it wasn't always the vested interests that were pushing these different discourses. Like, sometimes it's super well intentioned, and it's funny, like, I sometimes listen to, because people often play me stuff or show me stuff or talk to me about, like, but this is why it's hard and and I quite often, like, use the 12 discourses as almost like a bingo card. I think one of the interesting things is, like, there's so much stuff going on in the digital space. There is disinformation, there is misinformation.
Yes.
There's also the targeting of the climate activists in ways that make them feel like the cost of taking action is too high personally. So things like doxing or, like, threats of real world harm. That's real. And, like, when we were talking earlier about, like, most people are just, they're actually, it's just cognitive dissonance, or they're just sort of doing their job or whatever. That stuff doesn't come from that. That stuff actually comes from people who are trying to create deliberate harm in the world. And I think the fossil fuel companies are throwing millions and millions of dollars into this, and the climate, like, action side of I'm trying to not use a battleground analogy. So the fossil fuel companies are throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars into this every year, and on the other side of the equation, we aren't really taking the same approach. We're not playing with the same playbook. And I'm really curious to see what are the, like, very practical things that we can do to shift that, and whether it's like comms campaigns or different types of culture and arts and media, or if it's like different legislation that helps tell a different story. Like, I think all of these tools need to be used.
Agree, because it's not, and this is the thing that was a real aha moment for me, is it's not that you are just trying to move people who are stationary to being unstationary. You're trying to move people and communities and societies that are actively being pulled in the other direction. Like, there is a pull factor. There's but there are, actors and individuals who are not just entrenched incumbents. It's not like they're just standing there very strongly. They're actually pulling in the other direction. They're putting things in motion that take us in the other direction. And I think, in really insidious ways.
Yeah, and I think it's everything from like the way that they test the messaging to see what works.
Yeah.
Like they do really like quite deliberate, quite sophisticated things to test which messages sow this dissent, this like that catch fire and spread. They also have like done things like they've captured COP, right? Like the COP28 is being headed up by an oil company CEO. And, people can say that doesn't matter, but like just this week, I think there was a press release about how, if we're not really focusing on carbon capture and storage, then, we're going to lose the battle against climate change. It's like, yes, we absolutely need to be thinking about negative emissions, but all of the negative emissions technologies are far harder, not actually proven at scale. They're far more expensive, and simultaneously we know how to reduce our emissions, right? So why would we be doing these expensive, unproven things when we already have proven, less expensive options on the table?
This has been an incredible conversation. I just feel like I'm very happy that my co-host wasn't here so that I got to ask you all the questions this week. This has been Climate Curious. Remember, stay curious.
Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter, artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
curation by Maryam Pasha,
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshty,
music also by Ben Beheshty,
presented by Ben Hurst
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.